"Mom, I'll be back soon." That was the last thing Allison Warren ever said before she vanished. Brookdale, Colorado, a quiet, small-town community where people felt safe letting their kids roam freely. But on the evening of September 21st, 1996, that sense of security was shattered forever. The last time anyone saw Allison Warren, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, had always been independent, adventurous, and free-spirited. That evening, she told her mom she was heading down to the river trail, a place she loved to walk when she needed time to think. She was supposed to be home in 30 minutes, but she never came back, a mother's worst fear. At 8:30 p.m., her mother, Susan Warren, started to worry. Allison wasn't the type to ignore curfew. She tried calling her friends, but no one had seen or heard from her. Feeling uneasy, Susan grabbed her keys and drove straight to the river trail. She expected to find Allison still sitting on one of the rocks, lost in thought. Instead, she found something that made her stomach drop. Allison's truck was still parked near the entrance of the trail. The driver's side door was unlocked, and her keys were gone. But what disturbed her the most was what she found on the dirt path nearby. A half-full water bottle. Her denim jacket crumpled on the ground. Allison never went anywhere without that jacket. Susan's hands shook as she reached for her phone and dialed 911. "My daughter was supposed to be home hours ago," she told the dispatcher, her voice breaking. "She's not here. Her truck is here, but she's not. Please, something's wrong." The search begins. Within 30 minutes, officers from the Brookdale Police Department arrived at the scene. They began searching the wooded area near the river, calling Allison's name. Flashlights swept through the trees, cutting through the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of rustling leaves and the rushing water of the river. But then one officer found something disturbing. Lying just off the trail, partially hidden in the brush, was one of Allison's sneakers. And from that moment on, the search for Allison Warren turned into a race against time. As the search for Allison Warren intensified, police, volunteers, and search dogs combed the river trail and surrounding woods. Flashlights scanned the undergrowth. Helicopters flew overhead. Officers waded through the riverbanks. But hours passed with no sign of Allison. Then, just after midnight, a search team made a chilling discovery. A grim scene near the river. Roughly 300 yards from where her truck was parked, near a bend in the river, searchers spotted something pale floating in the water. As they got closer, their worst fears were confirmed. Allison's body was partially submerged, tangled in the riverbank's reeds. Her face was turned downward in the water, her arms limp, her legs caught on debris. Her clothes were soaked, but still intact. But what struck investigators immediately was that this did not look like a simple drowning. The immediate questions: if Allison had simply slipped and drowned, why was she so far from the main trail? Why were her jacket, shoe, and water bottle left behind, far from her body? And why were there visible marks on her skin? Something wasn't right. Officers secured the scene, blocking off the riverbank with yellow crime scene tape. The medical examiner was called in immediately. Meanwhile, officers notified Allison's mother, delivering the news every parent dreads. Susan Warren collapsed on the ground, screaming, "No, no, no," as officers tried to comfort her. The case had just shifted from a missing persons case to something much more sinister. And soon, the medical examiner's report would reveal that this was no accident. Allison Warren didn't fall into the river. Someone put her there. The morning after Allison Warren's body was found, the Brookdale County Medical Examiner conducted a full autopsy. At first, local authorities still leaned toward the possibility of an accident. Maybe she had slipped on the wet rocks. Maybe she hit her head and drowned. But the autopsy report shattered that theory completely. Disturbing findings. The examiner noted that Allison had multiple deep scratches along her arms and legs, the kind that didn't come from simply falling into water. There were large bruises on her wrists, suggesting someone had grabbed and restrained her. More chillingly, there were signs of sexual assault. The final cause of death was listed as drowning, but the manner of death was classified as undetermined. For Allison's family, this was devastating news. Not only had they lost their daughter, But now they knew she had suffered before she died. And yet, the sheriff's department hesitated to classify it as a homicide. This was a small town. Murders didn't happen in Brookdale. Authorities weren't used to dealing with cases like this. And without an immediate suspect, they didn't push for a full investigation. The case was left in limbo, with no official ruling of foul play. And even worse, Allison's family was never told the full truth about what had happened to her. The family's frustration. Months passed, and the case stalled. No arrests, no further investigation, no justice. The Warren family kept demanding answers, but each time, they were given the same response. There's just not enough evidence. But the truth was there was evidence. A partial male DNA sample had been collected from Allison's clothing. A man's boot print had been found near the riverbank. These clues should have been enough to treat the case as a homicide. But instead, the case was left to collect dust. And for more than 2 decades, Allison's killer would walk free. For months after Allison Warren's death, her family pushed authorities to take action. They knew she hadn't simply fallen into the river. The autopsy had confirmed signs of sexual assault. The investigators had DNA evidence and a boot print near the crime scene. And yet, nothing happened. The case remained in limbo, listed as an accidental drowning with an undetermined cause. Detectives never officially ruled it as a homicide. And without that label, they weren't required to actively investigate it as a murder. Why was the case ignored? The Brookdale County Sheriff's Office wasn't equipped to handle a case like this. It was a small town, and homicides were rare. Officers had experience with petty crimes, car thefts, and bar fights, not sexual homicides. Instead of admitting they were in over their heads, they let the case fade into the background. They had a partial DNA sample, but in 1996, forensic technology wasn't advanced enough to identify an unknown suspect. And without a clear suspect, the case wasn't seen as a priority. To make matters worse, the Warren family was kept in the dark. They were never told about the DNA evidence. They weren't informed about the boot print near the riverbank. For years, they were left with nothing but unanswered questions, false hope, and years of silence. By the early 2000s, the case was considered cold. Detectives retired. Case files were boxed up. The evidence sat in storage. For Allison's family, every year that passed was a reminder that no one was looking for her killer. Then, in 2008, they got a glimmer of hope. The FBI launched a national DNA database designed to store and cross-check forensic evidence from old cases. Allison's partial DNA sample was finally entered into the system. Her family waited, praying for a match. But nothing came back. Whoever killed Allison had never been arrested for another crime, or had simply managed to stay under the radar. The case remained cold. For another 2 decades, Allison's killer walked free. Until 2023, when a scientific breakthrough would finally uncover the truth. By 2023, the murder of Allison Warren had been cold for 27 years. Her family had fought for answers for nearly 3 decades. But without a suspect, without new evidence, it seemed like the case would never be solved. Then, everything changed. A new sheriff with a mission. In early 2021, a new sheriff, James Calloway, was elected in Brookdale, Colorado. Unlike his predecessors, Calloway had experience working homicide cases in larger cities. One of his first orders of business? Reopen the Warren case. After reviewing the original files, he was stunned by what he found. A partial male DNA sample had been collected, but never fully tested. A boot print near the river had been ignored. The family had been kept in the dark about crucial evidence. Sheriff Calloway immediately sent the DNA sample to an advanced forensic lab specializing in cold cases. If there was any chance to finally find Allison's killer, this was it. Forensic science finally catches up. Technology had come a long way since 1996. The same DNA sample that was too degraded to analyze decades ago was now fully testable with modern methods. In March 2023, the lab successfully extracted a complete DNA profile. For the first time, they had the genetic identity of Allison Warren's killer. Now, it was just a matter of finding a match. Genetic genealogy, a game changer. Instead of just running the DNA through criminal databases, investigators did something more advanced. They used genealogy. By uploading the DNA to public ancestry databases, forensic experts could trace the suspect's family tree, even if the killer had never been arrested before. It didn't take long. Within weeks, a match was found. The DNA belonged to one man, a man who had been living just 100 miles away from Brookdale for years. His name? Matthew Kincaid. And when investigators looked deeper into his past, what they found was horrifying. The DNA match was undeniable. The man responsible for Allison Warren's murder had finally been identified. His name was Matthew Kincaid, a 55-year-old former truck driver living in Fort Collins, Colorado, just 100 miles from Brookdale. For nearly 3 decades, he had managed to escape suspicion. But now, his past had finally caught up with him. The chilling background of Matthew Kincaid. Kincaid had lived a quiet, unassuming life, never drawing attention, never getting arrested. But investigators quickly discovered disturbing details in his history. In 1996, when Allison was murdered, Kincaid was a student at a nearby college. He frequently hiked the same river trails where Allison disappeared. He was known for making female classmates uncomfortable, but no formal complaints were ever filed. He had moved out of Brookdale less than a year after the murder, never returning. Even more chilling, after leaving Brookdale, Kincaid got married, had children, and built a new life, as if nothing had ever happened. But DNA doesn't lie. Authorities had everything they needed to confront him. The confrontation. On April 17, 2023, detectives drove to Fort Collins, arriving at Kincaid's modest suburban home. They watched as he stepped outside to get his mail, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. One of the detectives approached. "Matthew Kincaid?" Kincaid looked up surprised. "Yes, we need to talk to you about Allison Warren." For a split second, his expression changed, his body stiffened, his face went pale. But then he forced a smile. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little too casual. The detectives didn't flinch. "We have your DNA, Matthew." Silence. Kincaid's hands started to shake. His gaze darted to his front door, as if considering running inside. Instead, he forced another laugh. "That's impossible," he muttered. "I never even knew that girl." But the detectives weren't buying it. One of them leaned in closer. "Then why was your DNA found on her?" Kincaid said nothing. For the first time in 27 years, the truth had finally caught up with him. And he knew it. Detectives wasted no time. Just hours after confronting Matthew Kincaid at his home, he was brought into the Fort Collins Police Department for questioning. They knew he was rattled. Now they needed to push him to crack. The classic strategy, good cop, bad cop. Kincaid sat in the stark, gray-walled interrogation room, shifting in his chair. A single camera recorded his every move, capturing his nervous glances at the door. Detective James Calloway, who had reopened Allison Warren's case, leaned forward. "Matthew, we already know the truth. The DNA is there. We just need to hear your side of the story." Kincaid shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." But his voice wasn't steady anymore. A second detective, Rebecca Hale, sat down across from him. Her approach was different. "Look, Matthew, this is your chance to explain yourself. If this was an accident, tell us. But if you keep lying, things will only get worse." Kincaid's jaw tightened. His hands fidgeted in his lap. Still, he refused to speak. The evidence starts to break him. Detective Calloway slid a folder across the table. Inside were crime scene photos, forensic reports, and the final autopsy results. Then, he pulled out the DNA test results, a perfect match to the sample found on Allison's clothing. "Your DNA was on her, Matthew. We have the proof." Silence. Kincaid stared at the folder, but refused to touch it. His breathing quickened. He was trapped. "It's over, Matthew," Hale said. "You can either confess now, or let a jury decide your fate." For the first time, Kincaid met their eyes. His expression changed. Not to fear, not to anger, but to resignation. A chilling admission. Kincaid took a deep breath. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he whispered. The room went silent. Detective Calloway's grip on his pen tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked. Kincaid's eyes flickered to the camera in the corner. Then he shook his head and shut down completely. "I need a lawyer." The interview was over. But that single sentence? It was all detectives needed to confirm his guilt. Matthew Kincaid had just sealed his fate. The moment he whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," detectives knew they had their guy. But they weren't done yet. Kincaid had clung to silence, refusing to explain what really happened to Allison Warren that night in 1996. Detectives prepared for a long legal battle, a trial that could take years. But then, something unexpected happened. A sudden, desperate decision. The very next morning, officers arrived at Kincaid's holding cell to transfer him to county jail. But when they opened the door, he was already gone. Not missing, dead. Kincaid had taken his own life overnight, using the bedsheet from his cot. The man who had escaped justice for 27 years had just escaped it once again, on his own terms. For detectives, it was a mixed victory. There would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, no further confessions. All they had was his DNA, his criminal history, and those final haunting words in the interrogation room. It was enough to close the case, but not enough for true closure. The family's reaction: justice or betrayal? When officers arrived at Susan Warren's home to deliver the news, she didn't react at first. She simply stared at the officer in front of her, gripping the edge of her kitchen counter. "So that's it," she finally said. "He gets to take the easy way out?" For 27 years, Susan had fought for this moment. The moment her daughter's killer would finally be held accountable. Now, that moment had been stolen from her. "I wanted him to face what he did," she later told reporters. "I wanted him to see my face in that courtroom. I wanted him to hear what he took from us." Instead, all she was left with was a case file and a name. A case closed, but not forgotten. With Kincaid's DNA confirmed as the match, authorities officially closed Allison Warren's case in April 2023. The small town of Brookdale, Colorado, finally had answers that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. But for Allison's family, the pain remained. Justice had been served, but not in the way they had hoped. And for those who had followed the case for years, one haunting question remained. Did Kincaid have other victims? With Matthew Kincaid dead, the case of Allison Warren's murder was officially closed. But for Allison's family, the closure was bittersweet. They finally had answers, but they would never have the trial, the conviction, or the justice they had fought for. And worse, one chilling question remained. Did Matthew Kincaid have other victims? As detectives combed through Kincaid's past, they found disturbing patterns. From 1994 to 1997, he had lived in multiple small towns across Colorado and Wyoming. He had been accused of harassing women in college, but was never formally charged. A missing persons report from 1995 mentioned a girl last seen near a hiking trail, just like Allison. The problem? Kincaid had taken his secrets to the grave. Without a confession, without additional forensic evidence, police had no way to tie him to other crimes. But for investigators, the similarities were impossible to ignore. "Men like him don't just do this once," said Sheriff Calloway in an interview. "We may never know how many lives he destroyed." The Warren family's fight for change. Allison's family refused to let her become just another statistic. Her mother, Susan Warren, became an advocate for DNA testing in cold cases, working with national organizations to push for genetic genealogy testing in other unsolved crimes. "If they had tested that DNA sooner," Susan said, "he would have been caught years ago. He never should have been able to walk free." Because of her efforts, Colorado expanded funding for forensic genealogy, allowing more cold cases to be reopened. And just months after Allison's case was closed, another case from 1994 was re-examined using the same technology. The results? A match to a new suspect. Allison's legacy wasn't just about tragedy, it was about progress. Her case proved that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. And because of it, other families would finally get their answers. Final thoughts. Was this justice? Even with the case solved, one haunting debate remains. Did Kincaid escape true justice by taking his own life? Should authorities have pushed harder back in 1996? How many cold cases could be solved today with modern DNA testing? For Allison's family, the pain would never fully fade. But they had done what so many families never get to do. They had uncovered the truth, even if it had come 27 years too late. What do you think? Could this case have been solved sooner? Should Kincaid's past have raised more red flags? Do you believe he had other victims? Let's discuss in the comments. Don't forget to support the channel. Subscribe to the True Crime family. Insert link. Like and share this video to keep these stories alive. Comment below with your thoughts. Because justice isn't just about solving crimes. It's about making sure they never happen again.